In the depths of Missouri's Ozark caves, a wildlife biologist encountered something that defies scientific explanation. Deep in an unmapped cave system near Mark Twain National Forest, advanced scientific equipment captured impossible readings. Thermal cameras showed a void where heat signatures should be. Audio recordings picked up frequencies beyond known biological limits. The Ozarks hide thousands of unexplored caves stretching for countless miles through ancient limestone. Local legends speak of winged beings dwelling in these depths. Could these vast cave networks harbor unknown species that defy our understanding of biology? Or is something far more unsettling lurking in the darkness below? Some secrets, it seems, don't want to be discovered.
Secrets of the woods.
I've debated for weeks on whether to even send this to you, but after watching some of the deep dive discussions on your YouTube channel, I figure you might be the only person who won't immediately chalk me up as a total crackpot. I'm not even sure where to begin, so please forgive me if this gets a bit messy. My brain keeps jumping around in circles every time I sit down to put all of this into words. I guess I'll just start with who I am and what I do. I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in chiropterology, which basically means I focus my research on bats. I've spent the better part of the last 15 years traveling around North America, though mostly in the Mid-South, conducting population studies, collecting genetic material for biodiversity research, monitoring for diseases like white nose syndrome, and just generally doing a lot of caves that most people have never heard of. My professional background is grounded in hard science, so this entire experience has thrown me for a loop that I can't easily dismiss. Anyway, here's the gist of how this all went down. In late September of last year, September 28th, if memory serves, I headed into the Ozarks in Missouri for what I thought would be a pretty standard set of bat surveys. The area is near the Mark Twain National Forest. I've worked with a small private foundation that funds research into bat populations and cave ecosystems, so I was equipped with a decent chunk of grant money. I also had top-notch hardware that included infrared camera rigs, audio recording gear calibrated to capture the specific frequency ranges used by different bat species, standard sampling kits for gathering guano and other biological materials, plus a portable lab setup for quick field tests. Nothing unusual. I've done these sorts of surveys literally hundreds of times. We had identified several caves in this region that hadn't been surveyed extensively in the last decade, some not even documented thoroughly since the 1980s. The funding allowed me to do multi-day expeditions at each site. I started at a relatively well-known cave in Shannon County near the Current River. Everything was standard procedure there. Bats were healthy, the colony size was about what we expected, and there were no anomalies in the data. After concluding that portion, I moved on to a more remote cave system that had been flagged for a more thorough exploration. This system, which I won't name precisely for reasons that might become obvious, extends quite deep into the limestone. Locals sometimes refer to it as Gunter's Maze, just a nickname, not an official name, though it's not on any tourist maps because the area isn't exactly visitor-friendly. The entrance is on a piece of private land that's about a half-day's hike from the nearest road, and the property owner had given me permission to do surveys because my sponsor had negotiated everything in advance. I got there in the early afternoon, set up my base camp near the cave's entrance, and used the rest of the day to organize and do a preliminary sweep. Nothing special. I remember it felt humid, more than usual for early autumn, and I made a mental note that the temperature in the region had been fluctuating quite a bit that week. I also noticed the forest around the cave felt very quiet. You get used to the typical background noise of woodland creatures, insects, wind in the trees, that sort of thing. But there seemed to be a hush, almost as if the ecosystem was holding its breath. At the time, I shrugged it off, attributing it to my own nerves, because I was alone out there and was about to crawl into an unfamiliar cave system. It wasn't my first rodeo, but the older I get, the more cautious I become. The next morning, I grabbed all my gear and ventured inside. The first couple 100 feet were typical. Damp walls, standard rock formations, the occasional small stalactite. Nothing remarkable. But I did start noticing that the floor was more slippery than I expected, with patches of the slickest mud I've ever encountered. I almost fell on my butt a couple times and ended up using my trekking pole more than usual. At one point, I almost decided to turn back because I was worried about equipment damage, but the moisture levels were still within reason, and I was only a short distance in. I pressed on. Around an hour or so into my survey, I started setting up my stationary audio recorders. These devices are pretty standard. They pick up echolocation calls from bats, but also gather ambient cave noises. The data can be analyzed later to see if there are unusual frequencies or species we haven't documented yet. Right after I got the first recorder up and running, I noticed the microphone levels spiking with these bizarre harmonics. At first, I thought maybe I had a broken mic. This gear isn't cheap though, so I was annoyed at the possibility. I recalibrated and rechecked the rig. The spikes persisted. I tried adjusting the settings. Same result. The waveform was registering these quick, fluctuating peaks that looked almost like low-frequency rumbling, combined with very high-pitched chirps. Because I've done this a while, I know what a bat, or even a group of bats, typically sounds like on the readout. This was different. The pattern was something I couldn't explain. Eventually, I chalked it up to either weird acoustic echoes or some unknown geological phenomenon. Places like the Ozarks can have random seismic microtremors or weird air currents that cause whistling. But the more I listened, the more it didn't sound like wind or the usual subterranean water flow. It felt more organized, like there was a pattern or intelligence behind it, which obviously made me uneasy. I decided to move deeper into the cave to see if I could locate the source. The layout got complicated quickly. One tunnel led to a small chamber, with water dripping from the ceiling. Another led downward in a steep slope. I had a map from older surveys, but it was incomplete, so I ended up exploring a bit more than I'd planned. After placing another audio recorder in a side passage, I ventured into what seemed like the main corridor. It was there that I started noticing these crystals forming on the walls. Now, caves often have natural crystal formations, stalactites, stalagmites, or mineral deposits like calcite or gypsum flowers. But this was different. It looked like new growth, very sharp, translucent crystals that seemed to be forming on top of older calcite structures. The surfaces almost glistened under the beam of my headlamp. I was fascinated, even excited, because new mineral growth on that scale might be worth further geological study. But it also crossed my mind that the audio anomalies could be related. Maybe the vibrations from an unknown source were influencing the mineral environment. It was a stretch, but I made a mental note. I'd been in the cave for a solid 2 hours by then, maybe more. Time always gets fuzzy underground, but I was trying to keep track with my watch. My next step was to deploy the infrared camera rigs. Typically, I do that to capture bat flights in the dark areas, since infrared is less disturbing to them. I had 2 cameras with me. I set up the first near a spot with guano piles, a likely roosting area, and left it running. Then I pressed on, deeper, to place the second camera in another promising area. By now, I was well past the sections that appear on any standard map. The air was getting colder. In caves, the temperature can be relatively stable, but I remember it dropped to the point where I could see my breath in my headlamp beam. That was unexpected because it wasn't that deep of a cave system, at least not by the old records. Something else I noticed around this time: the unnerving silence was gone. I heard distant dripping sounds echoing. I assumed it was water, but every now and then, I swear I'd hear a faint, rhythmic tapping, like something or someone was gently rapping on the stone. I tried telling myself it could be water droplets hitting certain surfaces, but it sounded too patterned to be random. I couldn't locate the source. Whenever I paused and held my breath to listen, it would stop. When I started moving again, it would resume a bit later, always faint, never close enough to pinpoint. Adrenaline started pumping. I was alone, so my senses were on high alert, scanning for anything that might be dangerous or cause me to slip. The last thing I wanted was to get injured in a remote cave, especially if I was hearing something strange. This is where things go from odd to downright bizarre. I just finished placing the second infrared camera, aimed at a large open cavity that seemed well suited for roosting bats, though I only saw a handful overhead. I was looking at my thermal monitor, which displays a real-time feed in grayscale, with hot areas showing up as white and cooler areas as black. Normally, living creatures, like bats or myself, show up as lighter tones. But as I panned the camera around, I noticed this elongated black shape moving along the far wall. By black, I mean it wasn't registering any temperature at all, like an absolute cold spot or void. I double-checked to see if maybe it was just a shadow or an artifact on the display. But no. It moved in a way that suggested it was a physical entity. It was shaped vaguely like a tall, thin silhouette, but the edges seemed to shimmer. My first thought was maybe it was some glitch with the equipment. I tapped the monitor, shook the camera a bit, but it was definitely tracking something. I wanted to see with my own eyes, so I moved my headlamp to that section of the cave. The beam didn't reveal anything, just rock. But when I looked back at the monitor, the black shape was still there, now shifting slightly, almost like it was aware of the light. My heart was hammering in my chest. I tried to maintain my composure, reminding myself that I'm a scientist. Maybe I was picking up a thermal inversion or a pocket of cold air. Yet, an actual pocket of cold air wouldn't just move along the wall like that. The shape abruptly disappeared from the monitor, as if it had stepped around a corner. I was torn between wanting to investigate further and wanting to get the hell out of there. In the end, I decided I needed to at least gather as much data as possible. So I left the camera recording at that spot, hoping that if this anomaly reappeared, I'd have some footage. I turned back toward the entrance, planning to check the first camera and maybe reevaluate. As I retraced my steps, I started hearing that weird harmonic noise again, this time louder, and it seemed to resonate through the passage. The crystals on the walls, those newly formed ones, looked like they were vibrating or humming in response. The reflection of my headlamp on them created this eerie, prismatic glow, almost like a miniature light show in the darkness. I was seriously freaked out, but the curiosity was also burning inside me to figure out what the hell was causing this. I finally reached the first camera station and was about to pack it up and see what it recorded when I felt an unmistakable presence behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver passed through me that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. I spun around, shining my headlamp into the darkness, but again, I saw nothing. I stayed quiet for maybe 30 seconds, just listening. The air felt thick, like static electricity before a thunderstorm. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a massive, dark shape. It was leaning or crouching behind a rock formation. It stood upright, definitely bipedal, though hunched. My lamp didn't reflect off any eyes, which was strange. Usually, many cave animals have that tapetum lucidum that can glow if you catch it just right. But this figure had no reflective quality at all. It was like light just got swallowed by it. My logical brain tried to say, it's just a big piece of rock or a shadow. But then it moved. Slowly, it rose to a full standing position. If I had to guess, it was at least 8 or 9 feet tall. And then something unfolded from its back, or sides, revealing these gigantic, membranous wings that stretched so wide they scraped the cave walls. The wings must have spanned well over 20 feet, maybe closer to 22. I was frozen. Every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But another part of me was in total denial, like this couldn't be real. I must be hallucinating. Yet there it was. I was so terrified I couldn't even bring myself to speak or call out. Not that I expected it to respond in any human way. The presence of this thing filled the entire chamber with a sense of dread. I reached slowly for the remote control to my camera, hoping it was capturing the encounter. But as soon as I moved, the creature emitted this deep, resonant hum. It was almost like a subsonic vibration that I felt in my bones. The crystals on the walls started to tremble violently, and I swear I saw some of them fracturing, sending small shards tinkling to the ground. It all happened in a matter of seconds, but it felt like time slowed. I backed away carefully, my heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. The creature shifted its posture and took a few steps toward me. Despite its size, it moved with an almost effortless grace. The wings partially folded behind it, but I could still see the span as they brushed against the stalactites above, causing bits of debris to fall. The entire time, the thermal anomaly, this black void, was consistent. I pointed my handheld thermal viewer, a smaller device I keep in a side pouch, at it. There was absolutely nothing registering on that device except the cooler cave background. It was like the creature was absorbing heat or had a negative heat signature. I didn't see a face or eyes in the traditional sense, just a vague angular shape where the head should be. But I could sense it was watching me. I could feel an intelligence. That was the scariest part. It wasn't just an animal. It felt calculating, aware. Then, as though it decided I wasn't worth pursuing, it opened its wings fully, gave a single powerful flap, and vaulted upwards. The wind from that motion knocked me backward, and I slammed into the cave wall, dropping the thermal viewer. Rocks clattered everywhere. By the time I scrambled to my feet, it was gone, vanished into the darkness above. The air smelled burnt, like ozone after a lightning strike. I wasted no time. I grabbed my camera equipment, what I could gather quickly, and hightailed it out of there, leaving behind some cables and minor gear. My mind was screaming at me to just get outside, to get into daylight. I nearly slipped multiple times on that muddy floor, but adrenaline kept me moving. When I finally burst out of the cave entrance, it was late afternoon. I was drenched in sweat, covered in mud, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to anything. The forest outside felt oddly welcoming, like stepping back into sanity. But even then, I didn't feel safe until I'd hiked all the way back to my car, which took another couple hours. The entire time, I expected that thing to come swooping down on me. Could it have been a massive bat or a large bird that got distorted by my fear and the darkness? But there's no bird with a wingspan of over 20 feet in Missouri, let alone one that stands on two legs. And the shape, the negative heat signature, I couldn't explain that. Over the next few days, I started reviewing the footage from my infrared cameras. The second camera that I left deeper in the cave only recorded audio because it got jostled, or maybe I hadn't secured it properly, so the lens was pointed at a rock wall for most of the time. But the audio track was chilling. Analysis software later showed frequencies beyond the usual range of any known species of bat or bird. Some were in the infrasonic range, others in the ultrasonic range. The entire audio file is a chaotic mess of chirps, roars, hums, and pulses. The first camera, the one I had near the guano piles, did record some video. You can see me briefly, moving around in the frame. Then, about 40 minutes in, the camera angle shifts, probably when I was startled, and for a split second, you see a tall, dark figure in the corner of the frame. It's just a silhouette, but you can definitely make out the moment it unfurls these huge wings. The footage is grainy, but it's enough to make my stomach drop every time I see it. You can also see those crystal formations on the walls, looking far more extensive than they had any right to be. After that, I collected samples of the crystals that had flaked off. I also collected some guano that might have been contaminated or influenced by whatever was going on. I sent them to 3 different labs, one at a university in St. Louis, one private lab in Springfield, Missouri, and another contact of mine who works out of a research facility in Arkansas. I didn't tell them where I got the samples, just that they were from a newly discovered cave formation, and I wanted to identify the mineral composition and see if there were any unusual biological markers. The results that came back were borderline impossible. The mineral structure was identified mostly as a form of aragonite, a common form of calcium carbonate, but it had trace elements that shouldn't coexist under normal geologic conditions, rare earth metals, plus some exotic isotopes I'm still trying to understand. My contact in Arkansas said it looked like the crystals had formed under conditions of intense sonic or vibratory stress, which might have caused rapid nucleation. That alone was weird enough, but it gets more bizarre. In the guano sample, they found not only typical bat feces, but also bizarre cellular structures containing reptilian markers, specifically certain proteins that align more with reptilian biology than mammalian. Even more disturbing, there were cells that contained something akin to chiropteran, bat DNA, but spliced in ways that made no evolutionary sense. One lab flagged the sample as potential contamination because it was so unusual. Another said they found signs of quantum tunneling in the electron microscopy data, but that the results were inconclusive. They basically told me I must have mislabeled the sample or the data was corrupted. But I know better. I was meticulous with the chain of custody on those samples. There's no way they were corrupted. I tried reaching out to a few colleagues, but when they heard the entire story, they either politely dismissed me or outright said I'd lost my mind. I realize how insane this sounds, but I have the physical evidence, the video footage, and the audio recordings. I even considered going public with it immediately, but I was worried about the blowback. My professional reputation would be destroyed in an instant. Plus, the property owner wants no part of this. They just let me survey the cave under the Foundation's contract, and the last thing they want is thrill seekers or investigators poking around. I did make a follow-up trip a few weeks later, but only to the entrance area. I brought a friend who's also a biologist. We both felt an intense pressure or presence as soon as we were within 50 yards of the entrance. The entire area was silent. No birds, no crickets, nothing. We ended up leaving without going inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, and not by something that wanted to remain hidden. It was almost like it was daring us to come back in. My friend said that she felt nauseous, dizzy, and had a splitting headache when we got close. Once we moved away from the entrance, her symptoms subsided. We called it quits and haven't been back since. In the months following this, I've had intermittent dreams and nightmares about that creature. Sometimes I dream I'm back in the cave, pinned against the cold rock as it stands over me, emanating that deep hum that cracks the crystals off the walls. Other times, I dream about an entire colony of them, hundreds nested in some massive cavern, all humming in unison, shaking the earth. It's gotten bad enough that I've actually considered seeing a counselor, but what am I supposed to say? I'm having nightmares about a real-life gargoyle bat lizard hybrid that defies physics? And let me tell you, the strangest part is the sense that there's some government or military knowledge about these things, or at least about something in that area. A couple weeks after I got the lab results, I received a strange phone call. The voice on the other end asked me, very politely, to refrain from sharing my findings publicly because it could cause unnecessary panic. They wouldn't give me a name or an agency. When I asked who they were, the line went dead. I initially thought it was a prank, but my phone's caller ID just showed a weird numeric code that wasn't a standard phone number. I tried calling it back. No dice. Could have been a hoax, but it gave me chills. Then, about a week after that call, I went back to the lab in St. Louis to retrieve my samples. They suddenly claimed they couldn't locate them. The entire chain of custody documentation was nowhere to be found. Same story at the Springfield lab. They said they destroyed the samples because they'd kept them beyond the hold period, which is nonsense. Labs typically keep unusual samples for further analysis. The only person who still has some of the crystals is my contact in Arkansas, and they've gone completely silent on me. I know how all of this sounds. My rational side keeps trying to find a normal explanation. A new species of large bat. Maybe an unknown phenomenon with minerals reacting to sound waves, or even some elaborate hoax. But none of that fits all the data points, especially not the DNA analysis, and definitely not the direct sighting. You can't fake that kind of terror when a 9-foot-tall winged thing is standing in front of you, blocking out your light. People have asked me if I think it was extraterrestrial or interdimensional. Honestly, I have no idea. Part of me wonders if this is some undiscovered terrestrial creature adapted to the deepest cavern systems, maybe even connected to subterranean passages that run for hundreds of miles across the Ozark Plateau. The region is riddled with hidden caves. Who knows what might be lurking down there? But the physics of it not registering on thermal imaging baffles me. Every living organism emits some heat, even if it's minimal. The idea that it's a being with a negative thermal signature almost suggests advanced camouflage, or maybe it manipulates energy in ways we don't understand. I went down all sorts of rabbit holes online, reading about similar winged humanoid sightings. Everything from the Mothman legends in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to ancient stories of gargoyles in medieval Europe. I also stumbled across stories about interdimensional or ultra-terrestrial entities that can shift in and out of our perceptual reality. But I'm not an expert in cryptids or paranormal lore. I'm just a scientist who had an experience I can't rationally reconcile. The side tangents I go on in my head are endless. I'll be at the grocery store picking out apples, and suddenly I'll picture the cave's crystals vibrating until they shatter, or that shadowy shape slinking through a passage. I'll lose my train of thought and have to steady myself. My family has noticed how jumpy I am. I even considered stepping away from cave research entirely, which is heartbreaking because I genuinely love my work and believe in the importance of studying bat populations, especially with all the ecological threats they face. To say this event changed my life is an understatement. I question everything now, not just about biology, but about the fundamental laws of nature. My conclusion is that our scientific paradigm has blind spots, massive ones. There are phenomena we don't have frameworks for yet, whether these are new cryptids, undiscovered species, or something from out of this world, or dimension. I can't say. I can only present my findings and hope someone out there has pieces of the puzzle that I'm missing. There's also a sense of dread that if these things are more widespread, we might be in over our heads. The idea of entire populations of them existing in remote cave systems is terrifying. You, Josh, might be one of the few platforms where a story like this can be shared without immediate ridicule. It scares me to think how many missing persons in forested areas might be linked to phenomena like this. I'm not saying winged cave beings are out snatching people, but after what I saw, I no longer dismiss the possibility that our world is far stranger than we're taught in school.
If you guys enjoyed today's stories, be sure to smack that like and subscribe button so you don't ever miss another episode of Secrets of the Woods. I'll see you all in the next episode.